Evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to tonight's lecture, which is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmarks 2021 lecture series. I also want to add, we so appreciate your support and are so pleased that you can join us this evening. For those of you who might be a little less familiar with the General Society, a brief overview. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. Today, our 236-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, our John M. Mossman Locke Museum, and our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which, of course, tonight's lecture is part of. Before introducing our speaker, I want to mention that after the presentation, we will have a short Q&A of 10 or 15 minutes. So please feel free to submit any type questions during the lecture and of course at the conclusion of the lecture. We will try to get as many questions answered as possible on air. I also want to introduce, before introducing Dan Holohan, tonight's speaker, I also want to introduce our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle.
Thank you. Thank you. And good to know you're all here. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you.
When Dan Holohan was researching his book, The Lost Art of Steam Heating, in the late 1980s, he came upon a reference to the fresh air movement that made him curious. He dug deeper and learned of the relationship between steam and hot water radiators and the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. Tonight, he will explore this curious marriage that radiators and pandemics have, and one that continues, of course, through to this modern day pandemic. Dan Holohan is an international authority on steam heating and hydraulics. He began his love affair with heating systems in 1970 by going to work for a New York-based manufacturer's representative who was deeply involved in steam and the hot water heating business. He studied hard, prowled many basements and attics with seasoned old-timers, and paid close attention to what they had to say. Mr. Holohan founded heatinghelp.com in 1997. And this is a really amazing resource that I would highly recommend. So again, heatinghelp.com. His daughter, Erin Holohan Haskell, now owns and operates this extensive resource. He's also the author of dozens of books, including The Lost Art of Steam Heating and We Got Steam Heat, and hundreds of magazine articles about heating systems, old and new. He was an established speaker in high demand on the seminar circuit, having taught more than 200,000 people prior to his retirement. So we are so fortunate that Dan has come out of retirement once more to speak as part of the General Society Labour Lecture Series. And if you've been lucky enough to hear him speak before, you know you're in for a treat tonight. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you Dan Holohan. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Karen. It's so good to be here. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to talk to you for this whole thing. I don't have any pictures to show you. I just want to talk like we were together and having a good time. There is this curious marriage between radiators and diseases, and particularly pandemic diseases. And I first stumbled upon this in the late 80s when I was researching the book that I called The Lost Art of Steam Heating. And I'll get to that in just a little while. But first, let me tell you some cool stuff about those radiators. James Watt, the English steam engine guy, was the first person to come up with what we would now call a radiator. And that was in 1784. The British used to heat their greenhouses by just having a steam pipe come off of a very rudimentary steam boiler right into the greenhouse. So there was no radiators involved. It was just a pipe putting steam into the greenhouse, which would warm the air and humidify the plants. And James Watt gets this idea that he's going to bring the steam into his house. Of course, he can't have it just coming into the house like it went into the greenhouse. So he builds what becomes the very first radiator. And he does this by taking two soldered copper sheets and puts them together. So it's about the size of a sheet of plywood. Say it looks like that. And he puts this in his office, and he's got a little valve on there to let the air out, because steam won't go in if the air can't get out. And he creates the first radiator. And then some years go by, and later in 1823, Joseph Nason, who was an American, moved to England, and he went to work for Jacob Perkins, who was like the guy doing steam at the time and steam boilers. And all the stuff that Perkins was doing was brand new back then. And he was just making it up as he went along. So Joseph Nason goes over there and he goes to work for him, and he stays there for a while, and he soaks up as much knowledge as he could carry back to the US. And when he did, things really started to get pretty interesting back here. And this is at a time when you now see the Brits moving away from steam, because things were blowing up left and right. So they said, let's go on to something else. Let the Americans mess with the steam, which we certainly did. Now, around that same time, on October 3rd, 1854, an industrious young man from New Haven, Connecticut, filed patent number 11,747. Stephen J. Gould called his patent "Improvement in Warming Houses by Steam." 50 years later, his son Samuel would write this: "The first attempt at steam heating of which I have any recollection was in 1853 at Cornwall, Connecticut. My father was making experiments with steam, trying to produce a low-pressure, self-regulating steam heater which would be safe for domestic purposes, his attention being directed to the subject on account of the weak lungs of my mother, who could not endure the northern climate and so went south each winter to avoid stove or furnace heat." Now note here how someone's health plays a part in the very development of what we come to call the radiator. Mr. Gould was missing Mrs. Gould. Isn't that lovely? So he builds a heating system to get her back home. But back to Samuel Gould, the son. He wrote, "The popular idea of steam at that time was that it could not be employed for heating purposes unless under the care of an engineer. My father's aim, therefore, was to show that steam could be rendered safe by means of proper regulating devices. What Stephen Gould, the father, had done was to invent a small wrought iron shell boiler with a cast iron firebox. He also invented a remarkable radiator. This radiator was amazingly similar to the one that the Englishman James Watt had invented 70 years earlier. And James Watt, remember, was the first. Stephen Gould's radiator was two thin plates of steel iron or sheet iron, not copper as Watts had used. He fastened the two sheets together around a rope-like material to seal the radiator against steam leaks. And then he used a decorative valve on the inlet side to let the steam in, and a small cock on the outlet side to let the air out. That cock connected to an internal tube that reached down nearly to the bottom of the radiator. He knew that steam is lighter than air and would naturally rise to the top of the radiator, and the tube gave the sinking air a way out. And that's important because if the air can't get out, the steam can't get in. The radiator looks so much like a quilted mattress that the name stuck. The mattress heater became America's first house heating radiator, and Mr. Gould's system became the first attempt at what we came to call one-pipe steam. His system ran at low pressure, making it safe for in-home use. You didn't need an engineer when you had Gould's system. He also introduced the automatic fire regulator and a crude water regulator, and he applied a diaphragm to operate the safety valve. In addition, he had an open glass tube connected to his boiler at a point just below the water line. If all else failed, this glass acted as an automatic blow-off as the water line dropped. But it was the mattress heaters that caused the biggest stir. Manufacturers of cast iron heaters, that's what they called them in those days, heaters. And the pipe men, such as Walworth and Nason, America's very first heating contractors, furiously attacked the mattress heaters. And Walworth and Nason put heat in the White House. They were the first to do that. But Stephen Gold stuck to his guns, and it became, and because it worked so well and was safe, his system sold well throughout the Northeast. But what finally stopped him, and this is interesting, was the wailing of the women. Reports at the time said that the women always seemed to have some special thing to put right where that hideous great heating object had to go. A high-pitched cry went up against those ugly heaters. So in 1862, Joseph Nason, our first heating contractor, the guy that had gone to England, came up with his Nason pipe radiator. And that spelled the beginning of the end of the mattress heater. And by the way, Joseph Nason was the guy who came up with the name radiator. That lent a new meaning to everything he was doing. Radiator. It was like indoor sunshine. It radiated. Imagine how that must have struck people back then. The radiator. Nason's radiator had this horizontal iron manifold that sat on the floor, and he screwed into the manifold a number of pipes welded shut at their top ends. Some of those pipes were surplus rifle barrels left over after the Civil War. And Nason's radiators were expensive, though, because he had to cut, thread, and install each pipe by hand. A little later in 1872, the Bundy Loop arrives by Mr. Bundy. And this is another early radiator. It was similar to Nason's, but different in enough ways to make it viable. And these also needed to be screwed into the base and were expensive. But I've seen many of these still in service over the years, mostly in beautiful old homes and mansions. So they do last a long time. And at this point for the industry, growth was slow for everything. But then things began to speed up in 1878 when another heating pioneer, J.R. Reed, working for the H.B. Smith Company, invented the Reed Radiator. And this one was very similar to Nason's radiator with one huge difference. Reed pressed rather than screwed the pipes into their base. And that saved a massive amount of hand labor and immediately brought the price down. And with its small size, it spelled doom for Stephen Gold's mattress heaters. The last time we see the mattress heater is in a price sheet published in 1896. It sits unwanted and off to the side, like an old lady at a Sweet 16 party. But all hope is not lost. If you ever want to see one of those mattress radiators in operation, go down to the Fish Bar at 237 East 5th Street in Manhattan. There's a mattress heater steaming away up there on the wall. Show me something made today that's going to last that long. And my guess is nobody in that bar even notices it. I do like, though, that it's hanging out in the dive bar in the East Village. I wish I was. but once the pandemic's over. And speaking of pandemics and radios and a curious marriage, this is how this became popular for me recently. Last August, Bloomberg called me up and wanted to interview me about radiators and pandemics and all this. And I got such a kick out of that. So I talked to the reporter. They wanted to know if it was true that radiators were oversized because of the Spanish Influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. And I said, yes, they were. And they wrote that article up, and it got a lot of attention because it seemed to answer a question that was on the minds of at least many New Yorkers, where we have so much steam. Why is my radiator pumping out so much heat? So that appears in Bloomberg. And then I start getting calls for other people. Some newspapers in Cleveland called me up for an interview. There's a lot of steam in Cleveland, Ohio. Then I get a call from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and NPR and 99% Invisible. And then a guy from Ireland who runs a talk show over there calls me, and he wants to interview me. And I'm still trying to figure out what the heck that guy was saying because the brogue was so thick. So I got past that. And then CBC One Radio in Canada put me on this Sunday Magazine show. And all this was like day after day, I'm getting interviewed by these people. And then wonder of wonders, I wind up in Snopes, that website that proves, whether things are true or just lies. And I'm in Snopes under the question, are radiators oversized because of the Spanish flu? True or false? And Snopes says, true. And it quoted me of all people, which caused me to have mixed emotions because, who doesn't want to be in Snopes? But I always wish that if I ever made it to Snopes, they would say, Holohan's just full of crap. I don't believe anything he's saying. But my favorite part of all this is that I've been talking about radiators and pandemics for more than 40 years at my seminars until I retired in 2016. And when 2020 rolls around, I find I was absolutely living it now. It all comes back. Everything all was new again. But let's back up a bit and take a closer look at this. In 1861, Louis Pasteur came up with his germ theory. Not many people were paying attention to that. I mean, he's the first guy to tell us these things called germs. A lot of people were dying from cholera, influenza, and particularly tuberculosis. And they couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. But then on March 24th, 1882, Dr. Robert Koch announced the discovery of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacteria that causes TB, a disease that was killing 1 out of every 7 people living in the United States and Europe. And it wasn't until the 1890s that germ theory became widely accepted. So back it up a few years to 1865. The Civil War is over. Abraham Lincoln is dead. And out of the blue comes a man named Lewis Leeds, who was in charge of the Union Army hospitals during the war. And after the war, he was running the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And he begins to talk about the national poison. Now, what you got to understand is that Lewis Leeds was the Dr. Fauci of his day. Everybody's paying attention to this guy because people are dying from these things. We don't know what's causing it. We don't know about germs yet. Nobody's understanding what the heck is causing all this death. So he teams up with a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, she's the woman that wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she is probably the most famous woman in America right after the Civil War, and he's the most famous doctor. So these two get together, and they go on the road with this magic lantern show, and they're going to tell Americans about what they call the national poison, which is being in a closed space with other people and breathing each other's vapors. And again, they don't know what germs are. They're just thinking that there's stuff coming off our body and it's causing the air to be vitiated. That's the term that they used. And they go on the road with this lantern show. And he wrote a book called Leads on Ventilation. And in this book, he's got the slides that he used at those magic lantern shows. So you'd have one where there's a domestic scene of mom and dad sitting in the parlor, and dad's reading the paper, and mom's in a rocking chair and she's knitting. And in the next slide, in crawls the baby. And the baby's got a bonnet and a long, long gown, and the baby crawls. And the next slide's got this red vapor coming out of the father. It's seeping off his body, coming out of his mouth, and it's falling to the floor and creeping across the floor. And the baby crawls into this. And in the next slide, the baby's flopped over dead. So they take this around the country and they're showing all these horrible scenes of dead babies. And, you know, if you're in a room with you're smoking, there's fire, there's gas, there's all this stuff going on, and you're going to kill your children. So you got to open your windows, got to let all that fresh air blow in. And this is the beginning of what comes to be called the fresh air movement. It starts right after the Civil War, and people start opening windows, and they're opening all across America. And this is at a time really before we have central heat. Now we roll up into the 1880s, and people are used to keeping the window open to let that fresh air come in. And in the 1880s, we begin to see the advent of these beautiful Victorian radiators that have all that metal embroidery going on. And they start showing up in fancy houses and mansions, and central heating starts to become more popular. But consider what was going on at the time with air at this point, because now we're saying, okay, if we're going to put in radiators, why don't we close the windows? Because now we're trying to save a little heat. So consider the windows that they were using at the time, because they weren't the windows you think they were. Those early windows were double windows. So you got the double window, and the idea here is to keep the heat in the building. And articles begin to appear around the turn of the century where they're saying, we've got to get rid of these double windows because there's not enough air coming in, and they're very hard to. I mean, it's not like you just open them up, because you'd have to punch a hole in it, to get something going on. So I had this article from 1911 from I think it was the Chicago Tribune, that talked about no more double windows. That was the headline of the article. And they were so excited because they said, now that we've got this thing called steam heat, we can get rid of those double windows and use simple sash windows that are leaky that will actually let some fresh air in. And that's a healthy thing to have. So at this point too, you begin to see radiators moving away from the interior walls. Because you think about steam heat in the beginning, it was cheaper to pipe the radiators on the interior walls because you didn't have to run the pipes so far in the basement. But as soon as the double windows go away and the single pane windows arrive, they decide to move the radiators under the windows to heat this air that's leaking in through the sashes. So this becomes the normal way to do things, which made me think back to a time in the 1980s in New York when the city was hell-bent on replacing windows. And there was this big movement to get all these replacement windows going into a lot of the old tenement buildings that don't have mechanical ventilating systems. And they did this, and it was a big scandal at the time because the mafia got involved with it. There was a whole lot of money involved, and they put in these beautiful windows. And when people got the window, they closed them so it would be warmer. And then they start to take baths and they start to cook. And naturally, this puts moisture into the air, but there was no way to get the moisture out of the apartment. So what resulted was this massive amount of black mold that starts growing up the walls and across the ceilings. And it's really dangerous to your health and really nasty stuff. So the city now has to figure out, well, how are we going to solve this problem with these fancy windows? So to my delight at the time, they solved it by going back to every one of those windows and drilling holes in them. So they went to the metal parts and they punched holes all the way around the window to let fresh air in. So they basically took their high efficiency windows and turned them into old style, low efficiency windows. They should have just kept it like it was. At the General Society, we've got those old windows and they let in lots of fresh air. We just love them. See, so fresh air is important. And not all buildings have mechanical ventilation, especially the old buildings. And nobody plans for a pandemic. We should, but we don't. So in the late 1980s, I'm researching a book that I call The Lost Art of Steam Heating, which I self-published in 1992 because I couldn't get a single publisher interested in a book about something as weird as steam heat. So I'm reading all these old textbooks that went back to the days after the Civil War at the beginning of central heating. And I'm working my way through the decades. And I get to the 1920s. And in these textbooks, the engineers that are writing them begin to caution the contractors that are going to size these systems about what they call the fresh air movement. And they said, we have to be able to heat a building with the wind blowing on the coldest day of the year with the windows open. And I looked at that and I scratched my head. I said, what the heck is that all about? I had no idea what they were talking about. They don't explain. They just say we have to start doing this. And this appears in many of the textbooks that were written during the 1920s. So I got away from the technical books and I started to read more widely. And I began to read novels that were written at the time. And I began to read about how people heated their homes. And I came across, for the first time in my life, this thing called the Spanish Influenza, which, I mean, we all talk about it nowadays, but back in the 80s, I had no idea that this event had taken place. It killed 50 million people. It was the worst event in the history of the world. And in school, when I was growing up, I learned about the Chicago fire, the Johnstown flood, the San Francisco earthquake, all these things. Nobody told me about the Spanish influenza, which, by the way, didn't start in Spain. It started in Kansas. It started in Camp Funston, Kansas. A couple of soldiers got it. This is when we're involved in the Great War. They got it. They spread it to everybody in the camp. We didn't want to let anybody know that people were sick because that gives aid and comfort to the enemy. So these soldiers got on trains and they were sent across the country. And as they got off to have a smoke or get something to eat, they infected everybody in the towns they passed through. And then they were put on ships and they were sent to Europe. And by the end of that winter, this thing had become a worldwide pandemic and nobody wanted to talk about it. And the only country that did talk about it was Spain because they were neutral in the Great War. And they said, there's a pandemic. We have to wear masks. We have to socially distance. We've got to stop meeting in big groups. We have to stop going to church, synagogue, mosques. We have to stop going to theaters. We have to stop going to schools, shut everything down. Here we are living that again. So what happens afterwards, because this never comes back, it goes away in 1919, it mutates, the Spanish influenza, for which there is still no cure, never returns. Thank goodness. But we now see in the beginning of the 1920s, the Anti-tuberculosis League and the boards of health in many of the big cities begin to put up signs that say you must keep your bedroom windows open to avoid the flu. So we start to have people opening the bedroom windows because they don't want to die. Because they all knew people that died. And this leads to them opening pretty much all the windows. And the heating industry responds to this by writing textbooks that say, we have to accommodate what the people are doing. If they're going to open the windows, we don't want to get stuck putting in heating systems, which are relatively new at the time, and the heating systems aren't going to work. So let's make sure we size for the worst possible situation. The windows are going to be open. So think about these times now. We come off the Spanish influenza and the Great War, both of which were horrible events. And we go immediately into the Roaring 20s, which to me was a result of the Spanish influenza, because 50 million people just died. And the people that survived this look at each other and say, hey, what are we saving it for? Let's go have a party. And they have a party for the whole decade. They have the Roaring 20s and everybody's going nuts. They go from wearing long Victorian costumes to being flappers. So we go in the Roaring 20s, and because they're partying for the whole decade and investing irresponsibly, they cause the Great Depression. And the stock market crashes, and now people do have, at this point, central heating that got put in during the 1920s. But once the Great Depression hits, the coal is too expensive. So what are we gonna do? Why do we have the windows open? Close the window. Well, that's because of the flu. Well, the flu didn't come back. Close the window. We're going to save some fuel here. And they close the window. And now the radiators are putting out massive amounts of heat, and people are just gagging on it. So they say to the government, what are we going to do? And the government's looking to put people to work. They want to put engineers and scientists to work at that point because we're in a depression. So the National Bureau of Standards goes to work on this problem of why the radiator is so big. What can we do without actually, removing the radiators? And in 1934, they publish a pamphlet that says that if you use a paint called bronzing, and particularly aluminum bronzing paint, and that is the last cover that goes on the radiator, the last coat, you will reduce the radiator's output by 20%. And then they also realized that if you put a box over the radiator, a radiator cover, that will reduce it by another 30%. So this is why radiators are painted silver. And this is why you see so many radiator covers on those old steam radiators. The idea was to tone it down after the oversizing done by the Spanish influenza. So now, keep in mind too, at this time, we're burning coal. And in these old textbooks that I'm reading while I was doing my research, I come across this delicious statement that says, it's the women that are making the fire, keep the home fires burning. And they get up in the morning and they make the coal fire, and then they got to bank it at night. Then they get up in the morning and start all over again. The men are not doing this. The men are going off doing something else. But the women ran the boilers in the homes. So this one book is talking about, we need to add 70% volume to the firebox in case the husband tries to make the fire on the weekend, because he doesn't know what he's doing. So we start out from the get-go with boilers that are sized for open window ventilation and 70% extra for the husband. So now, rolling into the 1930s, coal becomes very expensive because coal is hard to get out of the ground, and there's labor strife in the coal mining regions. And there's also Texas oil being discovered. And it's discovered to such an extent that they actually had to shut the wells because the price of oil had dropped to like 10 cents a barrel at one point. So now suddenly you've got this, in 1919, we get the invention of the oil burner. And people are looking at that and they're saying, wow, I could burn oil and that could run off a thermostat. And the oil burner manufacturers are taking their marketing and directing it directly at the women. And they're saying, get rid of the coal. You'll have a cleaner house. You won't have these coal besmirched walls and soot all over the floor. You won't have to do all that hard work. And you see the ads with mom is standing next to the next to the thermostat, and she's got the baby there, and the baby is operating the thermostat, and it says, even a baby can operate it. It's so simple. But the oil people, they have to figure out how to change the fire without changing the whole boiler, because the whole boiler is still good. So they pull these grates out of the boiler on which the coal was burning. They're like a barbecue grill, and they fill the bottom with sand, and then they hang the oil burner on the door that used to open to put the coal in there. And the oil guys have to figure out, well, how are we going to size this oil burner? Well, we don't want to get stuck. We don't want to put in something that's too small. So they come up with these rules of thumb that say for so many square feet of grate area, we're going to fire so many gallons per hour of oil. And they leave themselves a real healthy margin. So already now we're sized for open window ventilation. We're sized 70% for the husband. And now the oil guy just showed up and add something to that. So these boilers go in there and they last, say, through the 1970s. And the OPEC oil embargo shows up in 1973. So now we're going to convert from oil to natural gas. Better for us. We've got natural gas here. We don't have to depend on OPEC. So how are we going to size that gas burner? Well, the gas guy comes in and he looks at the oil burner nozzle and he sees what it's firing. And he says, okay, there you go. That's the size of the boiler that we need. Get it? And since I'm the gas guy, let's add some more to that. And this is what we have going on. So these roll right up to the point where, now we're in the turn of the last century, and everybody's concerned about energy and climate change and things like this. So are we going to size that replacement boiler on what's there? Or are we going to go back and do the right thing and do heat loss calculations, or with the case of steam, measuring steam radiators, right? So speaking of all those savings that we're going through, global warming has an effect on construction, because we start to build buildings that are very tight to save energy. But again, nobody is planning on a pandemic. And it's only now that we're starting to talk about leaving the windows cracked open. And that's kind of funny, because it goes against everything that authorities have been preaching for years, right? Got to have tight buildings, got to have air exchange, but we have to do it through heat recovery ventilators and all this. But now with COVID, the air exchange is not sufficient to get the fresh air that we need for the COVID. So the industry is walking right up against this problem. The General Society building was built in 1890. We got very high grades recently when our building was inspected for overall efficiency, because we don't have fans. We don't have mechanical ventilation systems, so there's no motors things. We're on Con Ed steam. Our steam system, back to the way it was in 1890, is quiet, balanced, fast, efficient. So we got high grades. We got higher grades than some of the buildings that were built recently. Think about fresh air. Think about open air restaurants, people eating on the sidewalk. Think about authorities telling us that we're in cars, because cars have radiators too, right? Cars are zoned. You got, passenger side, driver's side, and even one window in the front and one window on opposite sides, so we can get some air moving through here. Fresh air again, simple solutions to things. And that's where we stand today. So I wonder what's going to happen with construction in the years that are coming up on us, because a lot of the people that called me for those interviews, particularly the people from the Wall Street Journal, said to me that they're getting reports from companies that are building really high-end condos. And because of COVID, they're building into these buildings very expensive filtration systems that are going to give the air just cleanliness and perfection like we've never seen before. And this is driving up the price of the real estate. And they're telling me that these things are not selling. And they said to me, what do you think is going to happen when this is all done? I mean, once we all get vaccinated. And I said, thinking back in the days after the Spanish Influenza, a couple of things struck me. I'm a reader. There was not a book written about the Spanish Influenza, with the exception of a novella called Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Think about who was writing at that time. Hemingway, Dreiser, Fitzgerald, all these people that were writing famous novels, none of them wrote about the Spanish influenza. And it was because we were tired of it. We were sick of death, we were sick of disease. And once it went away, nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. So I was saying to the people at the Wall Street Journal, I've got a feeling that once we hit herd immunity and everybody's vaccinated, we're going to walk away from this thing and nobody's going to be wanting to talk about indoor air quality as much as we're talking about it now. I think it's just going to fall by the wayside because we're going to start to think like we normally do. Why should we spend a lot of money on things that we probably won't need because the flu's gone? And what's that going to do to the business? What's that going to do to the construction industry? Just some food for thought. In the meantime, turn the heat up and crank open the windows. You can go back to saving energy when this damn thing is over. Did you like that story?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm so glad you spent time with me. And, since I retired, hardly anybody wants to hang out with me anymore. So thanks for keeping me company.
Oh my
And,
goodness.
I will entertain any questions you might have. And please ask me questions, only the ones that I can answer.
Well, Dan, thank you so very much. And we already do have some questions. So, I mean, what an overview. And to follow up on what you just said, I wonder really in 2 years' time, will this seem a distant memory, or will we all bear this in mind in the future in terms of our life and our buildings? Well, we'll find out, won't we?
We will. And, I said to the Wall Street Journal person, what did you know about indoor air quality in 2018? And she said, I don't even know what that was. I said, you weren't thinking about the air in the building, were you? She says, no, it's the last thing on my mind. I said, that's what happened after the Spanish influenza. They just didn't think about it. They just moved on. So we'll see what happens.
We will.
Let's stick around and find out.
We will see.
Okay.
Well, the first question is I can answer the first question. Is this being recorded, and will the recording be available afterwards? And the answer is yes and yes. We will probably send out the recording in a couple of days, of course, with Mr. Holohan's permission, but
of course.
We will do that. Yes, so you will receive this. This is from Brian Gill. What heating system is best for minimizing disease transmission?
I think the answer is, as it usually is with heating, it depends. Depends on the building. It depends on how it's being used. It depends on who's going to be in there. Depends on the disease we're concerned about. It depends on the budget that's available. It depends on just so many things. I think you have to take a holistic heating approach to this thing and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? And again, if the goal is pure air, absolutely pure air, we're faced with that situation like they are with the high-end condos where nobody wants to pay for it.
Right.
So that's a roundabout answer, but I don't think there's any, oh yes, do this. That's the best you can, that's the best way to go.
Right. Well.
And again, in the general society, we open the windows. We open them in the summer and the winter, and fresh air blows through there. It's a very healthy building.
And Dan, I just want to show the audience who's with us, if I could do this with my computer to show the size of these windows. I mean, can you see? Those are huge windows.
Yeah. And they're all that original glass too, that's got that wavy kind of look to it. And they leak. It's nice.
Yes.
Well, I feel good.
Yes. Perhaps those of us who sat in drafty apartments looking at the windows may be like reconsider that. But you're right. It is fortunate now to have an airflow.
Yeah.
Jonathan Catt says we need more of your stories. Raymond Ramos comments about how a great talk it was, as does LN. Paul Trotman wonders Oh, okay. He wants to, could you repeat the address of the fish bar? But I did write it down. So is it 237 East 5th Street? Dan,
Yep.
does that sound right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
nasty little place.
Well, it's certainly in the heart of the East Village.
Yeah, they have a website, and if you scroll through pictures of it, you'll see it. They have a picture of I mean, there's a picture. It's actually a picture of a Pabst Blue Ribbon and a shot sitting on the table, and the radiators in the background.
Right. Okay. Well, I look forward to the day we can all go visit the fish bar again.
Yeah, most people are just looking at the shot and the beer, you know.
Yes. Nora Lavori wonders, should we retain the 1899 radiators?
Absolutely. That's your best friend.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
I think you've proved that in what you've said.
And Karen and Dan, and we never want to brag, but we do have 103 radiators in this building.
Yeah, and each one has a thermostatic radiator valve on it.
It does.
That was beautifully donated to us by our friends at Tunstall up in Chicopee, Massachusetts. So thank you to them.
And then Gateway Plumbing and Heating installed it, expertly installed it, and thank you to Tunstall.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we made some, with our system, we made some changes basically in the basement. We put the Con Ed brought in steam, and the boilers that we had originally that are 10 feet high, 10 feet wide, and 20 feet long. There's two of them down there, and they were made in a building that is where the Hudson Yards is now, right down the street from Macy's. And you know, those boilers were built before the building. But when Con Ed came in, they essentially turned what used to be wet returns, pipes that were underwater, into steam mains, which was a big mistake. So we built a thing called the false water line, which is a little steam trick that was used for years, and that put all the pipes back underwater, back to the way it was in 1890, and that got rid of the banging and led to balance and just a beautifully operating system that saved a lot of fuel.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan, and our STEAM team. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for such a thorough answer. Okay, we had another question about the fish bar, but I think we've covered that address. And thank you for the nice comment. The person who also had a question about the fish bar made. What causes, and more importantly, what can one do to stop the clanking of the radiators, which I suppose has its own relation to air, and that's from Catherine Ratchlin.
Water hammers occurs only in horizontal pipes, and it's the effect that you get when water and steam are in the same pipe. The water is supposed to be able to drain by itself and get out of the pipe, get out of the steam's way. And if it can't, it builds up, and the steam is moving, you know, by design at 60 miles an hour, and it often moves even faster than that. So you've got what are essentially a gale force wind moving across the top of this water that's laying in the pipe because it didn't drain properly. You know, the pipe is sagged or the pipe is uninsulated. We remove asbestos insulation and don't replace it with fiberglass. So the condensation that takes place is much more rapid. So you wind up with too much water in the pipe. The steam moves across the top of it, and it causes this water, which is not compressible, to kind of turn into somewhat of an artillery shell. And the steam takes that slug of water, which is now completely filling the pipe, and just blows it down to the end where there's a turn. And when you get to that turn, the water hits that with tremendous force. And that's what you're hearing. So it's literally water hammer, which is a perfect way to describe this. So it's if you go on heatinghelp.com and just search water hammer, there will be lists and lists of things that can cause this. And also on Heating Help, you can go into the bulletin board, which is called the wall, and you can post photographs of where you're having the problem, and you will get answers from the best people in the heating industry when it comes to steam. And you'll get an answer within minutes because there's millions of people on that site.
Right.
So,
Right. Well,
so
well, there you go. Now we know where to find out many answers to that. I just want to mention that two people have raised their hands, and that would be Philip Tugenreich and Andrew Padian. I'm afraid we're not could you submit your question by typing it? I'm sorry for the extra trouble, but we're not able to answer questions on air with raising hands. So if I could trouble you to do that. A few more comments. Great presentation, says Joe Marciano. This is from LN. She just wants to know that she lives in the very type of building you've been talking about, Dan. It was built 1910 to 1920, 6-story elevated apartment building with superb radiators. And we, the tenants, do open the windows all the time. So very good.
Good. And you'll be healthier
Yes.
for now.
This is from Jonathan Katz. Do you think two-pipe steam systems of the 60s were as oversized as the ones put in post-Spanish flu?
Do I think?
Oh, do you think there, seemingly in the 60s, two-pipe steam systems were installed and were oversized? And do you think they were as big as the ones that were put in after the Spanish flu?
Probably not.
Right.
Probably not. Yeah.
The next question from Jennifer Munich, I should say. Where can I find original American standard brand radiator floor flanges? I'm having a hard time finding the high quality ones, metal, not plastic. Any advice, Dan?
I don't know, but again, this is one of these things. If he posts on the wall at heatinghelp.com, somebody's going to know.
Right. Okay. Again, so just to mention, heatinghelp.com, a tremendous resource. This is from Leola Spetch. Forgive me for mispronouncing your last name. So she has a 1927 Burnham boiler. It's the size of a Volkswagen Bug. I presume that means car. Converted from coal to natural gas. It has the standing floor radiators under the windows. It also has a radiator on the ceiling in the basement that is flat, parallel to the ceiling. Is the one hanging on the ceiling near the boiler in the basement a mattress radiator? Is that possible for you to answer without seeing it? Okay.
No, without seeing it, yeah. And I'd love to see that, because they had the radiators that get mounted on the ceiling in a basement would be there to get them above the water line of the boiler. So because below the boiler water line, everything in the building is underwater, all the pipes and everything below where you look at the gauge glass and you see where the water level is, everything below that in the whole building is underwater. So they'll mount a radiator on the ceiling to get it above that point so that it will fill with steam. It's very common, and radiators can be anywhere in the room. They don't care. I mean, if the room's heat loss is 10,000 BTUs and the radiator can put out 10,000 BTUs, the radiator could be anywhere. And as I said during the talk, in the early days, they put the radiators on the interior walls because that saved them on piping. And it was only after they decided to go with the single pane window that they moved the radiators to the exterior walls to get them under the windows to warm that air that they were wanting to creep in. So, but there also was a certain system that used a single radiator. It was called a Brumel system. Very, very good, and usually found in bigger homes of that era, where they would run the return lines coming back from the radiators through a ceiling mounted radiator. And that radiator had a pipe that connected into the chimney. And they used the draft going up the chimney to induce a vacuum on the inside of the steam pipes to pull the steam through. So it was an ingenious system that ran for, I mean, so many of them are still in operation after, more than 100 years, because they had literally no moving parts except for the steam and the water.
Right.
So it's she's got one of those, one or the other.
Right. Well,
photograph.
Leola,
if she wants to take a picture and post it.
Right. Okay. So you could send that to me, Leola, if ktaylor@generalsociety.org, and you can always follow up with me. Now, I see that we have 44 questions to go. So I don't know if we're going to be able to cover them all, but Dan, we're still, it's 10 to 7. Would you be certainly willing to answer a few more questions?
Absolutely.
Right. And Dan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but the questions we don't get to, would it be okay then if I forward them on to you, and perhaps you could, we can discuss them and I can contact people back with answers? Would
Oh,
that be
sure.
okay?
Or anybody can write me directly. It's just my name at Gmail, Dan Holohan at Gmail.
Okay, so, okay, well, there you go. Okay, so if we don't have get to your question tonight, you can email Dan directly at danholohan@gmail.com. Okay,
Right. No,
great. Okay,
no
well,
space between my names. I'm an old retired guy. I'm sitting around looking for something to do. So happy to help.
okay, well, that's great. Okay, well, I'm gonna pick up the pace in my questions, and I'm sure because some of these are really lovely reflections. Mark Woodcock, the first home he remembers on West 18th around 1945, no central heating, got a delivery of coal for the fireplace. But anyway, they all survived. And the question is, well, I think I can answer this question. Does the General Society receive city steam heat? In fact, maybe our executive director wants to answer that question.
Well, yeah, we're on Con Ed steam, yes.
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 Okay, so that way, yes, so we are certainly the recipients of this. This is a question from Dave Cattaneo. Going forward, how will building codes reconcile the conflict between the need to maximize efficiency while allowing adequate air exchange?
Dave, that's a question that's been on my mind so much in the past year that I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do because, if we're planning for the air, pandemic wise, that's going to be too much air if there's no pandemic. So how do you plan? Which is why I'm liking the idea of just opening the window. Winter's almost over. We're supposed to be out of this thing sometime this year, right? So open the damn window, in the meantime. But I don't know what the code's going to do. The code is a living thing that changes with people. But I do know that the stuff we were building, nobody was figuring on a pandemic.
Yeah, too true.
Nope.
The next,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead. No.
The next question is from Helen Day, president of the Richmond Hill Historic Society. A few of her group are having a discussion about heating in the oldest homes. Now, some of those would date, for instance, one from the 1880s. It is a number of fireplaces, 5 or 6. Would this be an indicator that radiators were installed later, or would that home have radiators installed when they were built? So I'm going to read that last bit again. Would homes that had radiators installed when they were built before 1900 have fewer fireplaces?
Yeah. And it depends on whether they're looking for the ambiance, of a fireplace, I would think. But the fireplace is probably the worst possible way to heat a room. It actually loses more heat than you pull more cold air up the chimney and in through the windows. Stoves were different, but it's my guess is that they had central heating in the 1880s. They were wealthy and they may have just wanted the fireplaces because they're nice to have.
Right.
So it's hard to say. Once again, it depends.
Right. Okay. This is an interesting question. So if silver paint reduces heat output, does black paint increase the output?
Yes. And it's not the color silver. It's the metal flakes in a bronzing paint. So there was copper and there was gold bronzing and aluminum bronzing. So one was a gold color and the other was aluminum, and the aluminum was more effective at reducing the heat, which is why you see so much of that on radiators. But if you paint over that again, it goes right back to where it was. In fact, there are certain colors, and again, this is all on heating help. There are certain colors you can add that would actually increase the output of a radiator. So if your radiator is not putting up enough heat, you could paint it a certain color, and it'll put out a couple of percentage more. I think the best you can get is like 3% more. But there are charts on heating help, and if you can't find them, just send me an email. I'll point you in the right direction.
Right, and again, that's danholohan@gmail.com. This is from Kathleen or Carleen Riley, and she wonders, She grew up with steam heat. Can it be put, she loves it, but can it be put into a single apartment?
In an apartment building?
Yeah,
Well,
just what, yeah, her apartment, presumably that would be quite difficult for just one apartment, yes?
well, she would, yeah, well, she would have to have a boiler that's just for her apartment. And
Right.
that would be a first.
Right,
I've never heard that done.
right. So Kathleen or Carleen, I think the answer might be no. The next question is from Julian Serwin. For NYC buildings, what would be the future of steam heat? When all the trends are to go to building electrification and heat pumps.
Yeah. The future of steam heat in New York is that it's all going to be ripped out. Hopefully slower than they're currently talking about, because we don't have the electricity yet.
Right.
And to rip out all the steam systems and put in P-tax, like those are the things that you'll find in like the Holiday Inn that's under the window. The buildings aren't wired for that. And as it is now, we have rolling blackouts in the summer because we can't run the air conditioners. How are we going to run all the heat, heat everywhere? So, and look what happened in Texas.
Yes, that is,
so
that is so
I mean,
true.
who's got more stuff going than they do? But of course, there was a lot more to that than just not having enough electricity. But it's the politicians will say, by a certain date we need to achieve this level, which is noble and it's good, but you can't get too far ahead of yourself. And in the meantime, there's a heck of a lot that can be done with the current steam systems to cut energy usage and to save money and to have quieter systems. And most of this stuff doesn't involve a lot of work. It's just knowing what you're looking at. But if you as a government take the attitude that steam is old, it's bad, it's got to go, and you get enough people buying into that, then there you are. But again, we don't have enough electricity.
And Dan, even what you have told in our conversations about the waste that is created, we've had these radiators since the building was built in 1890, and there's the radiators are still here, and with new equipment it becomes obsolete. It has to be changed after 25 years or whenever it has to be changed. But even to have these discarded, it would be a terrible waste,
It would, and they feel so nice
They
to stand
do.
next to that. You come in on a cold day, it's just it radiates.
It does. It does.
Yeah, it's like being on an iron beach. It's nice.
I also want to mention that Dan did have a lecture in the fall on the topic of being green in heat, and that can be found on our website, or if you can't find it, please just email me and I'll send you the link for that as well. Rena Corey remembers the smell of steam heat very fondly. This is from an anonymous attendee. Why do some apartment buildings have hot water heat on the first floor, but steam heat on the upper floors?
Sometimes they'll run hot water zones off of the steam boiler.
Okay.
That's very common to have in houses in New York City, where we used to call that the Brooklyn special, where you hook up a circulator to the boiler below the water line, and you pump the hot water out of the boiler around through baseboard radiators, and you heat the basement.
Right.
There's other ways to do it, but that's not uncommon.
It's coming up to 7. Are you good for another 10 minutes of questions, Dan?
Sure.
Okay, let's go. This is from Catherine Ratchlin. If the high-end condos could be built with windows that would open, would that be preferred?
I think so. Doesn't everybody want to have a window they can open? That's what they do in Europe. Many of the buildings have modern buildings and the windows open. They also have the good sense to put their shades on the outside of the window, not on the inside. It dramatically cuts down on the heat gain, because sunlight will pass through glass and change wavelength, and it can't get out again. Glass is like a check valve. That's why it gets so hot in your car. during the summertime when the sun shines through the window and the wave heats the upholstery and it bounces back, can't get out. So in Europe, for the most part, you've got these metal shades that come down on the outside of the window to stop the sun from getting through the glass. As a result, their air conditioning bills are much less than ours. We used to have something called awnings
Right.
that did the same thing, canvas awnings over windows. That's what they did. They kept the place cool. And, you know, that in our older buildings.
Okay, well, that's right. Now, but let me ask you like a follow-up, but if you're on the 23rd floor, I guess, is there some liability that you can't open the windows if you have 30th floor on the 23rd floor? Is that why people can't open windows in these high-end buildings?
It
Or who
depends.
Okay.
And you know, there's a building I visited called Commerce Bank in Frankfurt, Germany, that at the time was the greenest building in the world, and it was the tallest building in Europe, and all their windows open.
Right. Okay. Well, that answered that question. Helen Day comments, thank you for a most informative lecture, and she looks forward to reading at least one of your books. And we have another Dan Holohan fan, Thomas Nizel. Dan, I think I own your entire library of books. Thank you. Could energy recovery ventilators supplying outside fresh air be a key system for indoor air quality?
Yes, that's pretty much what we're doing now. That's the standard stuff. But you know, size for energy conservation is not size for COVID. That's the immediate challenge we're facing, which is why I'm a big fan of just cracking a window open for now.
Right. And this is a question that's very similar to one we did have before. How do you think buildings with steam boilers and steam heating can be best adapt to the push towards electrification, specifically in New York City? Do you feel you've answered that fully, or do you want to say something more?
Yeah, I was talking to some city people last week about this very thing. They called and they wanted to talk to me about converting from steam to hot water. You know, getting rid of the steam and using the same piping to run hot water system. And there's a lot of challenges with that because the system might not be able to take the pressure of water. You know, when you fill a building with water, you have a lot of weight of the water in the system itself. So I referred them to a system called that it's a vacuum system that's being used now by my friend, my Russian friend Igor, who comes up with this idea called Next Gen, and he's converting steam systems to run on vacuum in a most ingenious way. And you know, when I first heard about this, I thought the guy was crazy, and then I learned as I got older, you shouldn't call people crazy if they're right, you know. But what he's doing is he's taking existing steam systems and he's running plastic tubing back down in the basement. And before the burner starts the fire on the boiler, he's got a vacuum pump down there, just a regular vacuum pump that sucks most of the air out of everything. So now the system's in a vacuum, and water will boil at temperatures below 212 degrees Fahrenheit when it's in a vacuum. So when Igor fires the boiler, it comes on, it begins to make steam at temperatures like in 160 degrees. And that goes up very, very fast because steam in a vacuum moves extremely fast. And it's now heating the radiators as though they were hot water radiators. And this is very, very quiet and very efficient. And it's very similar to a system called the Paul system that arrived in New York at the turn of the century by a man named Andrew Paul, who would advertise in the magazines that if you use the Paul system, you will cut your fuel bill by 30%. And they did. And there's remnants of this in our building, General Society. There's remnants of this in many of the downtown Manhattan buildings. But the beauty of this is that under the vacuum, you're sending steam up at a lower temperature. And then when the vacuum begins to fall off and you start to get more pressure in the system, instead of the burner firing, the vacuum pump comes on again. And it pushes the system back into a vacuum, and this vapor from the hot water that's in the boiler begins to flow up to the radiators again to heat the rooms without firing the burner. That's where the savings comes in. So again, if you go on heating help, All of his technical papers are on there describing this whole thing. It's all there for us to look at. So what we have to do is have this mindset that this stuff may be old, but it ain't obsolete.
No.
You can
No.
make it efficient.
Absolutely. This is from Alexandra Peters. Do you get better ventilation on the top floors of the building?
Again, it depends on the building, because you know what? Sometimes you'll see the wind howling up the elevator shafts, or it depends on the construction of the building. Totally.
Okay. This is from Alan Glasser. Do you think people will be installing ERVs for fresh air?
Yeah, they're doing that now.
Right. This is from Elaine Norman. I read that steam systems were oversized in part to allow the space to overcome thermal inertia. Was this just an attempt to justify the sizing anomaly post Spanish flu?
I'm not sure what thermal inertia is.
Oh, well, it seems such an impressive term. I was impressed. Okay. So,
I'm not gonna fake it.
Okay. Right. Okay. Well, right. Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Email me. Tell me what it is, and I'll give it a shot.
Is there a modern radiator that now does not superheat a space?
Well, any radiator will superheat a space if the space is insulated enough and the radiator just never shuts off, and if it's hot enough, it's gonna overheat. But there's ways around that. There's thermostatic radiator valves that stop radiators from overheating. They just sense the air in the room and turn the steam off, or turn the hot water off, depending on what you're using.
Okay. This is another question from Leo Spetch. How come the steam heat doesn't warm the house, fill the whole radiator until the thermostat is set to at least 72 degrees Fahrenheit?
Well, the radiators are sized for the coldest day of the year. So that's the one day when the system is supposed to run 24 hours and the radiators are supposed to get hot all the way to the end. But in a steam system, if a radiator heats halfway or even a quarter of the way on a milder day, it's warm enough to turn up the thermostat. Once the thermostat is off, the burner stops running, so the steam stops moving. If the question is why is it cold in some rooms and hot in others, that's a matter of balance, and that can be solved with the right air vents in the right places. And again, all of that is on heatinghelp.com. How to size those vents, how to know which one to use where to put them, and again, it's a simple solution to a very common problem.
We still have quite a few questions to go, so I'm just going to actually here's another one that relates to a health issue. Some years ago, we were afraid of Legionnaire's disease. Is that only an air conditioning issue? No,
it's spread anywhere you've got stagnant water, so it can come out of a shower head. If you've got, let's say you leave New York to go out to a summer place. People go out to the Hamptons and they want to stay out there for a long time because of COVID. So wherever their home is, if nobody's running that water, the water's laying in the pipes, and that's when bacteria begins to breed. And when you turn the shower on, there's a vapor that comes into the air that we breathe. The moisture that's in the air, and that could have Legionella. So it's not just in cooling towers, it's in any plumbing where the water is allowed to stagnate. So the way we get around this is we'll run recirculation pumps that are designed to keep the water instantly hot for you. But these pumps can be set up to just turn on and keep the water moving periodically, so it doesn't have a chance to build up a bacteria. Okay, good. Now, I think I might partly answer this question. This is from Lev Chesnov. Can you organize an online tour through the General Society basement to see the old boiler and a heating system there? Well, perhaps at some point in the future, we could
possibly arrange something if Dan would agree, but that won't be happening in the immediate future. What do you think, Dan?
I agree. Yeah, when the time is right, I'd love to do that. I love showing the place off.
Right. Well, that would terrific. And Victoria, if you agree with that too.
It's the most beautiful building in New York City.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think we'll take one more question, and as I said, for the 22 questions, I
Okay.
will also forward them to Dan, the ones we don't get to. And I want to thank you for being such an active and wonderful audience and having such terrific
Yes.
questions.
Yes, thanks.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes. Why does steam heat seem so drying? I would think it would add humidity, asks Rima Finzi Strauss.
It actually does add humidity, and in the old days, and they still sell these. They have these tanks that you could hang on the radiator, and just fill it up with water, and it causes the water to evaporate. You could achieve the same thing by just putting a pan of water on top of the radiator or a pot of water, and that will become a humidifier for you. So yeah, often the dryness is when it's very, very cold outside and you've got air moving into the building. And again, these steam heated buildings are generally leaky. So that's what you're feeling, is the dryness of the very cold air. And steam radiators, I mean, often they'll add moisture to a building just because the air vents don't automatically close quickly. So you may get some humidity coming out of the radiator vent itself. Good questions. Great questions, people.
Yes. I mean, they've been fantastic questions. Anyway, that's a very easy and cheap way to get moisture in the room, isn't it? Putting a pot of water on the radiator. I'm going to conclude with the audience comments with one comment from Dennis Belanti. Can we have another seminar at the Fish Bar after vaccinations? Here, here.
Dennis is my dear friend from Denver, Colorado.
Oh, is he? Oh, that's great.
He and I have been on many adventures together. So yes, Dennis, I'm looking forward to that. You and Shelley, we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Well, that's great. And maybe some of us, some of our audience will also make the Fish Bar in the future. So, so Dan, I want to thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
A fount of knowledge and expertise, and we so appreciate you sharing it. I also want to thank Erin Holohan Haskell for all her help in promoting this. And I also want to mention that Erin is now the force behind heatinghealth.com. And as Dan mentioned several times, that www.heatinghealth.com is just a tremendous resource. And like you can also go there for any other questions you have related to steam heat and hydronics.
Yes, and she's my favorite daughter.
Let's hope your other 3 daughters are not on this seminar at the moment. As this is mentioned, this will be recorded and we will send out the link to this recording. So Dan, I'm sure Victoria would like to say something, but I just want to express our gratitude to you. It's just been lovely having you back at the General Society. So thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good night, everybody.
And Dan,
yes, Victoria.
I'll add to Karen's thanks very quickly. And thank you, for everyone, Dan, the way you say, no one wants to hang out with you. Well, that's not true. And I just want to mention tonight, someone even sent a picture of their cat that was captivated by the lecture. So she sent that to us, of the cat listening to you.
Wow.
So that was interesting.
I love that.
Yes, it was very funny, actually. But we can't wait till you're back at the General Society. And for those of our listeners who don't realize this, Dan is also our General Society president. So we're very honored to have him. And he is a great, great, great friend to the Society. So thank you, Dan. And we do look forward to your next lecture. And I just want to also say, for our tradesmen in the heating industry who are on this call, and the engineers and all the people in the industry, it's another reminder of just how much goes into all of this that people don't realize in terms of their home. it's a science, and it's academic, and you make it sound easy, Dan, with your books and your speaking, but we should be all very grateful, as I sit here at the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, founded in 1785, for all those who have come before us and all those who work now in that industry to make our world a better place. And for that, we are very grateful. So thank you.
Amen. Thank
Right.
you.
Right.
Thank you.
So we'll say goodnight. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take two very final quick thank yous. One, Angelo Vigorito, who's very much behind the scenes. I want to express our gratitude to him. The audience doesn't see him, but he's here at every lecture, and how much we appreciate that. And Alex Marks, who has been on tonight's talk. Alex launched us into Zoom, and we're very, very grateful for him, and is still someone I turn to for advice. So Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Yes.
Thank you, Angelo.
Yeah. So again, to you, our audience, just to remind you, our next lecture next week, which should also be great fun, is called If Frames Could Talk with Suzanne Smeaton. So we hope we'll see you then. And Dan, finally, thank you again so much. And now I will say good night to everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.